Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Bishop Bryan Ouellette coming to you live from the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains on this October 5th, 2018 for Vestiges After Dark. Tonight we're talking about memorials for the dead. Are they safe? Do they help the dead as much as they help the living? Or is it a recipe for spiritual disaster? My co-host, Joy Keeling, and I will tackle this very sensitive subject and give you the best information from personal experience that is available anywhere out there. I can promise you that. You're not going to want to miss this episode. Stay tuned. I want to thank you all for joining us here tonight for a brand new edition of Vestiges After Dark. My apologies for not being here last week. But, you know, the thing is, there's work that still needs to be done, and the teaching ministry of the church sometimes has to take a back seat to the more serious outward ministry of healing through exorcism ministry. And it's always a fascinating job. It's always a fascinating experience to be on that front line and see things a completely different way, far differently, I think, than what the average person can possibly imagine. It's a different kind of life, and it's a very interesting way of life. But we're here tonight, and we've got a very interesting topic. I think you're going to find this interesting, if not fascinating, and hopefully very educational, because that is ultimately my goal here, is to teach you about these things, teach you about certain aspects of the paranormal, topics that come up in paranormal discussion on a regular basis, but give you, a more personal, educated insight. I don't give you theories unless I come right out and say this is a theory. I don't even give you personal beliefs unless I come right out and say this is a personal belief. What I give you are direct observations. Take or leave it. It's up to you. But keep in mind, I'm in a very unique position to give you these observations, whereas the average person is not going to be exposed to the paranormal at the level that I am. So I feel that I'm quite qualified to give you some of these insights. And tonight I preface with this because I know a lot of you are not going to accept or want to accept some of the conclusions that we are going to draw tonight. Memorials tend to be a bit of a sensitive subject, and anytime it comes up on Twitter, for those of you who do follow me closely on Twitter and follow the various tweets that get sent my way, you've noticed that when I give a response about keeping ashes or setting up roadside memorials or getting a tattoo carved into your body as a memory of somebody that was meaningful to you who has passed on, you can see the resistance building and growing in the responses that I get. I mean, of course, there's sometimes people that are, fully prepared to accept my educated opinion on things, or at least my very educated observations on things. But there are those who will persist in their paradigms and not want to accept the reality. And so, hopefully we can find some middle ground here, because I'm not going to give you anything that is anything less than quality information. Okay? You can rest assured about that. Most of what I give you, unless I say otherwise, is been tested and proven, at least for the purposes of what we do, to be true. And that's where I'm going to be drawing this information from tonight. Just a brief note, if you do find the show of value, if you do find the ministries that we offer at the Holy Nicolaitan Catholic Church to be of value to you, please, if you can, don't forget, we are always in an operational deficit. So if you can assist the ministry with a donation, we are always very grateful for that. You can go to Nicolaitan.org or esotericcatholic.org. Both of those sites lead to the same place. And on the right-hand banner, the right-hand side column of the page, there is a donation button, and you can enter any amount that you want. For large donations, there's also options there for how that you can go about giving a very generous donation as a benefactor. But that's what keeps us going, folks. We don't. Our clients are in very rough shape. Our clients typically are not employed because of their condition, and their families are usually under great financial strain because of the situation. And, so we are not being supported in a normal way. I think a lot of people think that we're being supported by the Roman Catholic Church or the Vatican or something. We are not. Okay, well, nobody supports us except all of you. We don't have a congregation that we can appeal to. We don't run a traditional diocese or eparchy. We don't run traditional parishes that have parish life. It's all about generosity and kindness and giving of yourself, which is what we all do here as volunteers, and myself included. I am a volunteer. I do not take a salary at the present time anyway. Maybe someday I will be able to, but right now I can't. So it's all for the good of God's creation. And if you can help us to continue to do that, I can guarantee you that those efforts will be, those resources will be well spent on proper things, not some of the things that some ministries ask for and misuse those donations. We make sure that those donations go to the purposes that they were intended to be given for. Okay, enough of that. Let's go ahead and get started with this topic. I know that Joy has a lot to share with you tonight, as do I. How are you doing tonight, Joy?
I am doing wonderfully. I'm just so excited.
Yeah, this is a good one, and it's again, part of the fun of this show is drawing topics from Twitter, social media, things that people come to us with and want questions answered on Twitter. And even though Twitter a while back expanded the character limit, and I am forever grateful for that, it's still insufficient for some of these questions that come in. One of those questions is roadside memorials. And I put out a little story on Twitter when I got back from my most recent case in Los Angeles with Sister Mary Joan, which is why we were gone for a little bit. And I'll mention it here again briefly, just for those of you who might not have seen it on Twitter. But I was driving home late. My flight had gotten in pretty late, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning by the time I was passing down one of the main country roads off of where I live. It's a very dark road. It's fairly heavily traveled for the location, and it's very close to the interstate as well. You can see the interstate from from the early part of this road. And so, about a few years ago, there was a woman who I'm not quite entirely sure why she was out there, but she was out there walking this very dark, unlit country road at about midnight, a little past midnight, actually. And a drunk driver. There's at the end of this road. There's a trucker's stop. It's like I said, it's out there in the country, and it's one of the last primary locations for the trucks to stop before the long haul. And there is a little bar, and I guess it's like a motel over out that way. And I guess somebody had gotten drunk and driven home and was going down that country road and hit this lady and killed her. And so there was at some point after this incident a roadside memorial put up on the side of the road. Crosses with her name on the cross. Presumably, I think she had a young son, so this might have been something that the family had done together as a way of healing, perhaps. Some psychologists think it's a healthy part of the healing process, the grieving process, and there is, I guess, a certain amount of truth to that for the living. But the question here is not so much whether or not this is a good thing for the living, but also whether or not it's a good thing for the dead. And sometimes what seems to work for the living is not actually what's working for the dead. So, every time I pass by that memorial, I would, say a prayer. I don't know what it is about that particular one. Maybe it's because it's the only one in the area. It's very close to where I reside, and I see it frequently. I'm not quite sure why it gets stuck in my consciousness, but I seem to notice that one more than the other ones. And I say a prayer when I am inclined to do so, when I pass by it. So on this particular night, coming home from the Los Angeles case that we had just done, it's about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I'm driving down the road, and I see the memorial, and I decide that I'm going to say a prayer. So I said a very quick one, and I continued to pass on. After the memorial, the road sort of turns a bit and then goes up a hill. Like I said, I live in the foothills, and there's lots of mountainous terrain around the area. And as I was making that turn, there on the side of the road was a woman hunched over. She wasn't wearing any shoes, which I thought was quite odd because it's not the kind of area that you would typically want to take a walk without your shoes on. And again, it's very dark. There's nothing really around the area. There would be no reason for you to be walking over here. It's not really a good spot to take an evening stroll. And she was hunched over as though she were in pain, could not see her face. She was actually in a very awkward position. It didn't look natural. And so I started to slow down because my instinct is she okay? I mean, should I stop? Should I find out if she needs help? Maybe I should call the police. Now, I don't typically stop for people on the side of the road because, the world we live in today, and who can you trust? So, you have to look out for your own self. And so, typically what I would do is slow down, roll down my window, ask if she's okay, and then call the police if she's not. So I proceeded to turn around. But as I did that, I noticed she was gone. There was nobody there. There was nowhere that she could have run off to because, it was thick woods on both sides, very steep hills, not really a place that you could, just dart off. There's no houses in this area, so she was gone. And it was like instantaneous. And so I have felt that this was that particular spirit, still unrested, still connected to this roadside memorial that marks the location where she passed. Incidentally, I should also mention that I received a new piece of paranormal equipment a few years back, which was very close to the time period where she had died. And I always test out the equipment so that I can get very familiar with it. And this was the brand new Ovilus that had just recently come out at the time, and I was still fiddling around with it, getting comfortable with the new Ovilus. And I had turned it on just to start to calibrate it and see if I could. And the one of the first words that came through was the name on the roadside memorial, indicating that she's still very much active in the area and not at rest, which is the point I'm trying to make here. And this is how I'm going to precede this conversation, because what we talk a lot about in the paranormal, particularly for those of you who are interested in the darker side, featuring the demonic, and certainly that's become more of greater interest in the paranormal field. You see it in television. Even Ghost Adventures has definitely started to explore the demonic, which is how I came into the picture, really, for that particular show. And so there's interest here. There's interest in learning more about that aspect of the paranormal. And so we talk a lot about demonic attachment, or even spirit attachment. This is a word that's become, prolific in paranormal circles. Nobody even questions what that means. If everyone seems to already know what it means. If you're into the paranormal, you know what an attachment is. But the part of that nobody really seems to be making a connection on is that a spirit attachment is identical. Okay, the demonic attachment, spirit attachment, let's just put them all into one category right now, is identical to what I would call philosophical attachment. You might say, what does that mean? Well, in order to really fully understand what I'm talking about, it perhaps might be important to mention a little thing or two about some of the core tenets of Buddhism. Because while all religions have a basis for this, even Christianity, I don't think anybody does it as well as Buddhism does it. And so we're going to perhaps make this easier to understand if we do it from the Buddhist standpoint. I'll talk a little bit about what Christianity thinks about this in a moment. But for right now, it's important to just look at it from the Buddhist perspective, because I think really they have the best model. Okay. And one of their tenets, one of the things that is intrinsic to the Buddhist worldview, is something called the Four Noble Truths. In fact, you could say that this is sort of the golden rule of Buddhism. If the golden rule of Christianity is to love your neighbor, as you would love yourself, then, the golden rule of Buddhism is the Four Noble Truths. And so the first noble truth is that everything is suffering. Okay? Everything. Birth is suffering. Death is suffering. Living is suffering. Aging is suffering. Everything that we do eventually results in suffering. You might say, well, vacations are pleasurable. Yeah, they're pleasurable until you have to come back to work. Then the suffering begins again. Okay? So we've become so accustomed to suffering that we don't even really necessarily pay attention to it unless it's extreme. It has to be painful for us to get to the point where we're saying, okay, this is suffering. This sucks. But, doing a job that's kind of monotonous, you kind of just get used to it. Yeah, there is a faint echo. I think it's because Joy's system, unfortunately, is not working correctly. So she is on a cell phone, and so the cell phone might be giving a little bit of feedback. But bear with us if is it terribly disturbing? Tell me if it's terribly disturbing, and we can see if we can I can mute her down until we're ready to actually engage in conversation. Let me know. Nicole says it's not too disturbing. If anybody else finds it disturbing, let me know, and I can just lower the recording volume on her end until we start conversation. You won't notice it so much when we're conversing, but when it's just me talking, you can kind of hear it. Anyway, so everything's suffering. The Four Noble Truths. The first of the Four Noble Truths is everything's suffering. And so there is a specific word that's used in Sanskrit to refer to this, and that is known as dukkha. Okay, dukkha. Now, there's really no good English translation of the word dukkha. It's kind of one of those words that exists in Sanskrit in isolation. Doesn't really translate well, but it can kind of... one way of perhaps translating it would be dissatisfaction due to impermanence. Okay? So, dissatisfaction due to impermanence. And so, the problem is, from the Buddhist worldview, from the philosophy that governs Buddhism, the reason we suffer is because we attach to things that are impermanent. And impermanent things eventually dissipate, and then we suffer when we lose them. Because we become emotionally invested. And our emotions want to be satisfied. They want to be satiated. But the First Noble Truth says it cannot be. It's impossible. The only way to be truly satisfied is to abandon your need for satisfaction. In other words, to abandon your attachments. Because we all have them. Okay, so that is called philosophical attachment. And that attachment is identical to what spirit and demonic attachment is. They are formulated the same exact way. It's just depending upon who's doing the attaching. So when a demon attaches itself to you to feed off of your energy, perhaps as a target of some kind, then all it is really doing is forming an attachment through your emotional vulnerabilities. In fact, we had a discussion on this on Twitter today. Somebody had mentioned something about being afflicted and how they have no control. And I said, the only control a demon has over you is the power that you give it. Your emotional vulnerabilities are your undoing, and that's why you feel you have no control, because you don't have any control of your emotional nature. And that's what creates the conditions for a demonic attachment. The same thing that creates the conditions for a spirit attachment, even a benign one. And there are benign ones, the ones that don't bother us, the ones when people say, oh yeah, my grandfather died a little while ago, my mother died a little while ago, and I still feel her around. They say it almost like it's a good thing. It's never a good thing. All right? Don't be fooled. It's never a good thing for a family member to be unrested. You know, the little, it's almost approaching Halloween time, and, we have the archetypal, iconic graveyards that people put up in their yards, and, you see the gravestones, these styrofoam gravestones that people put up in their yards to create a nice, scary scene for the trick-or-treaters. And they what do they all say on there? R.I.P., rest in peace. That comes from the concept that the dead are vulnerable to being unrested. The ancients knew this, which is where all this comes from. And so it is our job, the living, to make sure that they are rested. So how do we do that? Well, the first step is the same very thing that prevents you from being unrested when you die is the same thing that can prevent them from being unrested when they die. And that is the cessation of attachment. So the problem with memorials is that they are emotional beacons. They're not being erected as some kind of indifferent. I don't know. I don't even know what to say. Some kind of indifferent method of marking a moment in time. That's not what they're being erected for. They're being erected as a means to remember a person who has died in usually a tragic way. I mean, if it's a roadside memorial, it's going to be a tragic way. It's like car accident of some kind, whether it was in a car or, getting run over, whatever the case is. They're being erected for emotional reasons. And as we know from philosophical attachment, from what Buddhism teaches us about it, these attachments are formed through our very rudimentary, primitive emotional center. Because we are attached to people and we shouldn't be. Not in that way. Doesn't mean you can't love people. Doesn't mean you shouldn't love people. It just means you need to love in such a way that your love is malleable, that it can flow through the process of life and not get stuck on the things that cannot be changed. Okay? We cannot avoid losing people that we love. That's inevitable. And it will never be an easy thing for anyone, no matter how sophisticated that they are. But what we can control is how we deal with our mourning. Because how we mourn has a dramatic impact on those we're mourning for. And people don't understand that. And this is where we start to see the seed being planted for paranormal disturbances. So what we're going to analyze here is what kinds of things we can do to avoid this and what kind of things we are currently doing that cause this. So obviously you all know my stance. You should by now know my stance on keeping ashes. Okay. You've seen it on Ghost Adventures twice now. It was in the Ogden episode, kind of more subtle there, but it was there. It was definitely central to what was going on in Ogden. And then we saw it in Sin City. Okay. This is this new thing, this new trend that people are taking the ashes and putting them into an urn and keeping them in their house. Now, that is equivalent. Spiritually speaking, that is identical. It is equivalent to putting a corpse in a coffin and keeping that in your house. Now, I don't know anybody who would want to do that. But yet there are too many people that are more than happy to keep an urn with ashes in their house. And they see it as different, probably because the ashes don't stink and decompose. Honestly, let's be just realistic about this. Pragmatically, it seems clean, but it's not. They are still the remains. And whether or not, I know some of you are probably fans of the television show Supernatural. And I know that on one of those, in some of the lore of that show, if there's an unrested ghost or something, then what they do is they dig up the corpse and then light the corpse on fire, or they dig up the bones and they light the bones on fire. That solves the problem. Well, unfortunately for Supernatural, that is not true. That it doesn't matter if the remains are incinerated down to nothing. Whatever does remain is still the remains and still contains the essence of the individual. And as long as that is the case, then there is a seed for attachment. Why? Because why would you keep the ashes of a loved one in your house if you weren't emotionally hanging on to them? You're not letting go. You're not truly mourning when you do not let go. At some point in your mourning process, you have to say goodbye. You have to move on. That's how you let them move on. So in Christianity, as in Buddhism, there is a ritual process for this. The rite of Christian burial is what is the preferred methodology in Catholicism for handling the dead. And what this involves is a funeral rite, in which case the body is retained, usually an open casket if it's feasible. There's a wake, a funeral mass, and an opportunity for all of the loved ones to say goodbye. And then the remains are buried. And then the rite of Christian burial essentially creates a seal so that that loved one cannot move back into this realm. And through grace, they can find the means to cross over. Okay. We help them to do that by our prayers and by our letting go. If we don't emotionally let go, it's no easier for them, because guess what? They don't have a brain anymore. They don't have the faculties of intellection to guide them. They don't have reason. They don't even have consciousness. They just have instinct. And instinct is governed by emotional content. So the only language that the spirit has is truly emotional. So if you're in such grief that you're not letting go, that's the only message they're receiving, then they can't go. Why would they? They feel the same way about leaving you as you feel about leaving them. And it creates an unhealthy condition. And unfortunately, again, this comes from, a great amount of ignorance that's being taught out there in paranormal circles as well as in religious circles. Or, largely from the New Age, unfortunately. This idea that we are immortal by our nature, or that spirits are immortal. That's not true. Okay? When the body starts the decomposition process, the spirit starts the decomposition process. And it degrades. It just degrades at a very different rate than the body. It doesn't follow the same pattern. The body is more dense, and so therefore it decomposes far more quickly. But a spirit can degrade very slowly. And as a spirit degrades, it loses more and more and more of itself. Eventually, all that's left is the raw nature. And if that person died traumatically, tragically, was murdered, accident, you name it, if it was an unfavorable death, and if that person didn't have the means to accomplish a skillful death, because they perhaps were not spiritually motivated and were not well trained in how to die well, and we'll talk a little bit about that tonight as well, then what will remain or what will result is what we would call a wrathful spirit, because all that's left is the anger and wrath. And so your grandpa that you love having around the house, if he doesn't cross over, then you won't be able to distinguish him eventually from another demon. You won't. And I have had this conversation with so many families, and they don't want to hear it. I've even had clients that have come to me with great paranormal disturbances. We've brought us in. We've diagnosed the problem. We've done full investigations and determined that the cause of the problem is a dead relative. And then as soon as they find that out, they don't want me coming back. I don't want you to send him away. And so the problem persists. And my feeling is, well, thanks for wasting my time, and thanks for making, his afterlife miserable. How wonderfully selfish of you. So when we're talking about memorials, the danger with memorials comes from the fact that they are emotional structures. They are done out of grief, sadness, loss, all of the recipe for attachment. And it's the same, like I said, same attachment. Okay? So it creates a spirit attachment. Philosophical attachment creates spirit attachment. Spirit attachment creates philosophical attachment. One and the same thing. And so what ends up resulting here is the conditions for an unrested spirit. Same thing with these people that go and get the ashes converted into some kind of piece of jewelry that they wear around the neck. Same thing with people who go and get a tattoo on their arm that memorializes some loved one. In fact, that's even worse than a roadside memorial, because anything that's permanent creates an archetypal permanence. And so therefore, now you're creating the seed for a permanent unrested attachment with a tattoo. Because that becomes marked into your flesh. You create an enmeshment with the spirit of that. Actually, when you die, you can actually create a fusion of those two spirits, and they combine into a type of wrathful spirit that really is just horrible. In fact, I would actually say that some of these manifestations that people are being attacked sexually by spirits. This is like a very common thing now I'm hearing of people being assaulted sexually by spirits in the night. I have good evidence, and I don't have time to get into it tonight. Maybe sometime in the future we'll talk about it. That these types of spirits that do this are the result of a combined spirit as the result of some kind of attachment. One person dies, a living person can't let go. They create unnatural memorialization within their life, and then they create a spirit enmeshment. When they die, then that becomes this monster of a wrathful spirit. Two entities now stuck together when they shouldn't be, wreaking havoc on whoever, because now they're no longer them. See, it's not grandpa anymore. You know what I'm saying? And they think it is. It's only grandpa for a time, just like it's just us for a time. You're here for maybe 60, 70, 80 years, and then you're not here anymore. Okay? In 100, 200, 300 years, most of us will not even be remembered. We'll be lucky if we're remembered 20 years after we've died. Okay? And that's the way it should be. That's good, because that creates the conditions for a clean death, when there's nothing holding us back, and we can move on and cross over with confidence. Okay? So any kind of memorialization that is not ritually putting those remains to rest creates the seed for an unrested spirit attachment to come later. Now, I've had people, and I need to mention this because it's going to come out, that have said, I got a tattoo, and I don't feel that, the person I got the tattoo about, whoever it is, I don't feel that they are unrested. I have never had any problem. And they tell me this as if to say that, see, you're not really right about this, Bishop, because, I've done what you're saying not to do, and it didn't cause any problem. Well, that's kind of like saying, I've smoked, 3 packs of cigarettes every day since I was 15 years old, and look at me, I'm 75, I still don't have cancer. So, cigarettes don't cause cancer. It's kind of like that. Because just because you're doing something that's risky and you happen to get lucky doesn't mean that it's not risky. The problem is, why would you create the seed for this kind of unnatural condition? Why would you not want your family member to enjoy the most rested possible state, to have the best chance in the afterlife, or what we call the afterlife? Why would you not want them to have that? Why would you want to keep them stuck here where there's nothing? Nothing. I mean, this is the fallen world. I mean, if you're going to, let's get back into the Christian worldview for a moment. But it's actually no different than the Buddhist worldview. They just, rather than call it the fallen world or original sin, Buddhists just say everything's suffering. It pretty much means the same thing. And so why would you want to stay here in what the Buddhists call samsara? trapped on the wheel of birth and rebirth over and over and over and over again, never escaping it until you attain to enlightenment. For Christians, that would be like salvation, entering into the grace of Christ, and then entering into the kingdom of God. Why would you want them stuck in that kind of condition? If you really love them, you wouldn't want that. But see, they get this romantic notion where they say, "Oh, you know what? He's going to stay with me until I go, and then we'll cross over together." I've been told people tell me all sorts of things. They believe all sorts of things, and I have to just shake my head and say, if you only knew, what you think is your loved one is not even them anymore. You know, it's kind of like, you know, I don't know. It's kind of like it's kind of like looking at the vestige of something that occurred very, very long ago and confusing it with the very thing itself. Sort of like, you know, when you're kids and, you know, you might fall into puppy love and then you go into the woods or something and scratch, you know, your initials, you know, on the tree, and then, you know, you put like JP plus, you know, CS with a heart around it. You know, it's kind of like confusing that with the actual two people that grow up and live completely different lives and do not share those feelings later on. It's a vestige of something that occurred, but it doesn't represent any of the reality anymore. And that's what ghosts are. They're just, they're an echo. Okay? It's a degrading echo that gets less and less structured as it continues to persist. The more you hold on to it, the more it regresses into its primitive form. And at that primitive form, it is just fear and anger. This is where all these demons are coming from, folks. Believe me, there's not a whole lot of fallen angels out there to torment you. Most of them are wrathful spirits because there's just too many unrested spirits out there. You've got religions who are not doing the proper ritual rites to rest them. You've got, and I'm not talking just, I mean, you know, it's not just Christianity that does it right. You know, Buddhism has the sky burial, the Tibetan sky burial is one of the most beautiful things. In fact, I even have it in my will, even though I know it's completely illegal in the United States, and I have no confidence that it will ever be able to carry it out. I wanted it set in my will for the record that I want a Tibetan sky burial. If you don't know what that is, watch the movie Kundun and find out. I will leave it at that. But honestly, you know, that is a truly wonderful way, ritually, to be rested, because it truly brings home the reality of what has occurred and leaves nothing remaining. That's the best way. Christian burial does a very similar thing. Hanging on to ashes, not so much. Okay. So we're going to advise against roadside memorials. We're going to advise against memorial tattoos. We're going to advise against, you know, keeping ashes in your house or setting up some kind of memorial in some room somewhere, or putting, you know, an urn on the mantle so that grandma can watch, you know, The Price is Right with you every morning. Okay. We're not going to advise those things. Julie, the movie is called Kundun. Kundun. It's the story of the Dalai Lama's exile from Tibet to India. It's a wonderful movie. Great soundtrack. So we're not going to advise those things. Okay? Because this is what we are resolving all the time. Me and my clerical team are constantly having to work with these types of situations over and over again. Unrested souls, people that are emotionally attached, don't die in a state of anger, don't die in a state of unrest, because it can also happen from the other side too. Spirits can not be ready to go and they can attach, same way that we can attach by not letting them go. Okay, so
Am I here? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I wasn't sure if I was on.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I've just been really quiet.
No, 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 you're fine. Did you have something to contribute?
Yeah, because of course, I sent you a hint of what I wanted to talk about, and of course, you're talking about exactly what I experienced. Because I passed by a roadside memorial a couple of years ago, and I wanted to share the story if I could.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. Well, I had a friend that was getting married in California, and I decided to uh, drive out there. And so I saw a bunch of little things along the way. I really enjoyed the trip, because I love going, uh, seeing different little roadside attractions and stuff. But I was really cutting it close, getting to my friend's wedding in time. And so I knew I had to get going, and I was trying to book it. I was going as fast as my tiny little car would go. And sometimes that's not very fast.
Hmm.
But I was coming over this hill, and I started freaking out. I felt like the sun was in my eyes, and I was panicking, thinking I was about to crash the car. And I pulled off onto the side of the road. There was a bunch of gravel on the side of the road in case a semi going down the road can't stop in time so they can pull over. And so I pulled off, and I was sitting there just shaking because I
Hmm.
was convinced I was about to crash the car. And I looked around, there was nothing anywhere around me. I thought, well, my gosh, that's crazy. I don't know what that was about, but I grabbed something out of the trunk of the car that I knew I would need, and then I got back in the car and I took off. And I managed to get there 10 minutes before the wedding actually started. So at least I got there before everything got going. But the next day, I was going around seeing scenic sights, and I had decided, since I was planning the trip, well in advance, I thought, I can find a roadside attraction, maybe something haunted. So I went through my day going and seeing the sights, and I thought, I don't want to miss the James Dean Memorial. I don't want to get there when it's dark because I want to be able to see everything because it's outside.
Right.
And as I'm driving, I put in the coordinates for my GPS to take me to Blackwell's Corner, which is the last gas station where he stopped before getting in the wreck. And so as I'm following the directions the GPS is sending me on, I see a restaurant that looks awfully familiar. And I'm thinking, did I pass by here yesterday? And then I look, and there's this wide open space. The street kind of curves around, and there's another street kind of intersecting with it and stopping there. And I look to my right, and it says James Dean Memorial Junction. And I look up, and on the other side of the street, you can still see my tire tracks where I had stopped the car because I thought I was going to wreck. That was so cool.
Wow. Yeah. So you actually
So,
sort of experienced
yeah.
the spirit's moment.
Yeah, it was that moment where, oh crap, I'm gonna wreck. And of course, reading about it, I read about it before I ever went out there. He had tried to go around the car because there was a car that was turning up that street that intersected, and he couldn't get around it, and he ended up flipping the car over it. And it was because he couldn't see. The sun was in his eyes. He wrecked just before sunset.
Oh,
And I can tell you, when you're going down that hill, you can't see what's in the valley if the sun is coming right at you.
yeah. Yeah.
You really can't. And so I felt those last moments. But the thing
Yeah.
is, I I felt I felt like he found some kind of peace as he realized there's no way out of this. I'm just going to die. And he let go. But people encounter a spirit. I encountered a spirit, and it seemed to be James Dean. But what I determined it was after interacting with it for about 37 minutes, I think is how long uh, the audio recording that I did.
Hmm.
Because of course I wanted to investigate too, but I didn't bust out most of my equipment. It's kind of weird. But I was interacting with the spirit, and it was coming through, and at times it seemed like it was, we were having a conversation. But what was I interacting with if it wasn't James Dean? It was the thoughts of all those people for the past, and it's now 63 years and 5 days, because Sunday was the anniversary, the 63rd anniversary of his death at that intersection.
Right.
So for the past 63 years, people have been driving those last miles to connect with James Dean. And their images of him, their thoughts of him, those projections, the things they brought with them, what they have there is not, it's not James Dean, but it thinks it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really an amalgamation of a bunch of stuff that's just been kind of left there and deposited there by hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, this is so relevant. Unfortunately, I can't even talk about it. But what you just described really is a great precursor to what occurred in Los Angeles. Now, when I can talk about that case publicly, I will. I can't at the present time, but at some point in the future, we'll be able to talk very openly about it. And it is very similar to what you're talking about right now. This idea that the energy gets collected.
Yeah.
All of the attachments themselves become entities. See, this is where we start to get into the whole idea. I don't know how many listening tonight listened to our previous show on the 4 types of demons, but it's always worth mentioning. Remember the fallen angels, the elementals, the created, and the wrathful spirits. We already talked about the wrathful spirits tonight, but the created, these are like egregores. These are like thought forms that are manifest. And see, people think that, these are only like familiars where you do some ritual magic, a conjuration, some kind of occult practice, and you create some type of entity that does your bidding. And certainly there is that. But what people don't understand is that grief and over-emotionalization can create them too, accidentally, in fact. And our emotions, our feelings, they can become so powerful that they actually can create images of themselves that get manifest as living entities, real thought forms that exist and are intelligent, or at least as intelligent as they think they should be. As intelligent as the copy that it is would be. I was actually in a case once where we were investigating, and this, I've mentioned it on the show before, I'll mention it tonight. We were investigating in this room that was it was previously a gymnasium. It was a big house, and they had a gymnasium downstairs. And so, like gymnasiums tend to be, there's mirrors all over the wall. So this was a room of mirrors. But the new residents took out all of or did not have the exercise equipment. And one of the primary residents of this house was using it as a meditation spiritual room. And, mirrors tend to be amplifiers and conduits. Part of the whole reason why at Jewish funerals they would cover mirrors, and it all comes into that same general idea. And so we were in that room because it was very active. That was one of the rooms, perhaps the most active room in the entire house. And when we went in there and started doing an EVP session, unfortunately, it was not caught on camera because the person that saw it was actually using the SLS, and the SLS doesn't capture video that way, as most of you probably already know. They saw that I was looking towards the SLS camera, which means that the mirror was behind me. And so what would you see in the mirror if I was looking in the opposite direction? You'd see the back of my body, right? I mean, because my back would be to the mirror. Well, one of my investigators who was in front of the SLS looking at me, facing me, saw my reflection turn around and look at everybody in the room. It was my reflection. And so it wasn't reflecting my back. It was reflecting as almost as if it was a mirror, an image of what they should be seeing from the front. And it was kind of almost like a doppelganger, which I really think what doppelgangers tend to be. Sometimes I think people think they're some kind of malicious spirit that's imitating another person. And there certainly is a precedent for that. But I think more often than not, when people are encountering doppelgangers, what they are actually encountering are superfluous spiritual aspects of ourselves that get broken off and thrown away. And I can tell you with great confidence that most people are haunted by their own traumas that have become over emotionalized and then break off and then torment their creators. So this is one of the primary reasons why we do not want to have a memorial or any condition that would allow for a spirit to not find rest. Now, in the early stages, it's fine. Okay, so even in Buddhism, it's usually considered highly recommended for a spirit, for a body rather, to be left alone for at least a minimum of 3 days, or until the signs of release are observed. Which means when the spirit finally breaks away from the body entirely. But for the first 3 days, spirit and body are one. Can you imagine how traumatic it is being thrown into an incinerator, a crematorium, and you're still attached to your body? Imagine how frightening it is to have an autopsy performed or to be embalmed. But this is what we do in the West. And it leads to tremendous unrest out there because most people are not spiritually prepared for it. So getting back to what that other individual was saying, I did all these things and it didn't cause me a problem, so you must have something wrong here. Well, I can explain that. Because the conditions are that some people die well. Some people are ready. Some people know what to do instinctively. Some people have grace, have cultivated grace, spent many, millions perhaps of well, maybe not millions, but hundreds of thousands of hours in their lifetime, praying and cultivating grace. And then that is enough. It's sufficient. So even if all of the conditions left by the living are not met correctly, and the memorials are set up, attachments are set up, even so, they are able to transcend those attachments and still cross over without any problem at all. So we're going to talk about, when we get back here, we're at the top of the hour. When we get back, we're going to talk about dying well. What that means, to die skillfully. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
I am here in the middle of nowhere. There is no there, it is cold there, but I am safe and I am warm. Although it's hard, I know I gotta keep up. No time to lay, to drift away. I fill my space, I spend my time down the rabbit hole again. And as I fall, I can feel the pain. You can't tell me where to go, so I don't know, I just go with the flow. I go with the flow. lots of love, but I guess I deserved it. Trying to hide, to pass you by. I'm getting time, feeling fine. I'm light as air, no one can reach me. Lost in a dream, lost in between. Let's keep on flying, let's keep on breathing. I'm falling up, I'm falling down. From the sky and from the ground. Up above just like below. And I don't know where I should go.
Just like the street lights lit this town, like a fire in a blaze, gotta burn it down. Can't be afraid to leave this out. We got this far, don't know how. I see danger in your eyes. They know we'll burn down the night. Coming just like the sunrise. You know that we're gonna let it out tonight. We're gonna let it out tonight. We're gonna let it out just like the sunrise. We're gonna let it out.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Bishop Bryan Ouellette with co-host Joy Keeling, and we're getting ready to start up the second half of the show tonight on memorials for the dead, the hidden spiritual danger. Joy put up her video from Blackwell's Corner. You might want to check that out on Twitter. You can find Joy at JJoyKeeling. Go check that video out. And I see a lot of questions out there. We'll be answering them here shortly. Stay tuned. I see that some are asking some very good questions.
The seasons come and go like thought.
I don't know why that kicked up. Sorry about that. But I noticed that there's a lot of questions here that are very, very relevant to the discussion that I don't want to miss here before Joy and I start getting into some more conversation about this. But they, the idea of going to the grave and saying a prayer at the gravestone, is that acceptable? I'm seeing some of you ask questions about that, which is actually a very good question. And that is okay. Because, as I said, it assumes, again, you got to talk about the way that the burial took place. But if the proper rite of Christian burial was performed, or at least something that approximates it well enough, then it creates a ritual seal, in which case the individual that is being rested into the ground will, by grace, not leave that, not rise up from that location and become attached to someone else passing through, or even be susceptible to the emotional vulnerabilities of the people who come to visit.
That's what it means to be buried in hallowed ground.
Yes, exactly. And that's why it is important to be buried in hallowed ground.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah, because it is ground that has been ritually prepared for the purpose of resting the dead. So, yes, in that kind of context, thank you for mentioning that, Joy, because I think that is something that is overlooked today a great deal, at least in terms of how people tend to whitewash the importance of these older ways because they don't understand them and they're not quite sure, how important or how relevant they are to us today, or they think it's a superstition or some kind of just like outdated tradition, but it doesn't really hold any intrinsic value, and yet it does. It really does. These things were always done with purpose. There was nothing that came to us from iniquity that did not have a significant spiritual purpose. It's just people have forgotten what they are, or they don't take them seriously anymore. So yes, being buried in hallowed ground prevents attachment. Or at least is one of the best aids to preventing attachment. Of course, there is always going to be the risk of attachment if the person who in question is not ready to be rested. This is getting us back to what we were talking about before the break on dying well, dying skillfully. What does that mean? You hear me talk about that a lot, but I'm not sure everyone really understands what I mean by that. And so dying skillfully means dying in the wisdom of God. It is not sufficient to just die in faith. That's a good start. But it's not, if you're really concerned about being rested, then you're going to need to do a lot more work than just have faith. You're going to have to do a lot more work than just believing in God. There's a lot more to it than that. Okay? And one of those things is having a spirit of detachment yourself. And a lot of people struggle. And I understand why they do. Because, where do you draw the line between loving and taking care of your immediate family, but being detached enough to let them go when the time calls for it? Where do you place those barriers? How do you know how to discern that? This is where grace comes in. Because it is only through grace that we can actually achieve to these realizations. And so, as a Christian, one would cultivate that grace through the sacraments of the church, through prayer, through meditation, and through reaching out for a direct experience with God, at the most deliberate level. There's 3 stages of prayer that we talk about, and I think it's perhaps something that all of you should know. There's oratio, which is sort of the oral prayer. Okay, so that's more of the standard kind of prayer where, you're praying with words. Okay, so chanting, liturgy, Our Fathers, Hail Marys, rosaries, all of that, although the rosaries can kind of be a combination of them. But right now, all of that type of praying, even the prayers that you say perhaps out of your own words, grace at meals, and even praying silently in your head but using words, this is oratio. Right? That cultivates some good grace. But if you want to take it even further, then there's meditatio. And this is where you start to meditate on the mysteries of God through Lectio Divina, which is reading meditatively 1 verse or 2 verses from Scripture and reflecting on it over and over again, reading it slowly and deliberately over and over again until you have processed every word and then something is revealed to you about it. Or the mysteries of the Rosary, meditating as you're going through the Hail Marys on the mysteries of the life of Mary. Okay, that's meditatio. And then, of course, standard meditation, which is not terribly different from Buddhist meditation, centering prayer, which I'm a strong advocate of. I know that a lot of Catholics out there are afraid of it. They shouldn't be. It's a wonderfully beautiful thing. And that's also another form of meditatio. And then the last highest form of prayer is contemplatio. Okay, so oratio, it's Latin for, oral or oration. Meditatio, meditation. And then contemplatio, contemplation. Now, contemplation you cannot achieve through your own merits. This is pure grace. God decides when contemplatio occurs. But if you're not ready, if you're not prepared, if you're not cultivated, it doesn't happen. So you use oratio and meditatio to condition yourself to be ready for contemplatio should God see you fit to receive it. Okay? So this is how you cultivate grace. This is how you remove attachment. You detach. What did Christ do on the cross? He is God. Okay? He could do it any way he wanted to do it. And how did he defeat death? By dying himself. By sacrificing everything he was on the cross. Giving it all up. And what does he tell us to do? Go and sell all you have and come follow me. That is a literal command. In other words, remove all your attachments to the worldly things. They do not matter. They do not last. Sounds like Buddha. There's even a wonderful book called Living Buddha, Living Christ. It sort of shows the parallels between the two. And they really do have a lot. And it just goes to show that this wisdom is universal. It doesn't matter if it's East or West. It doesn't matter if it's a different type of religion. It still applies. And non-attachment, you see it in the spiritual exercises of very many saints, certain types of retreat programs, monasticism. It's all about abandonment to get to a point where you no longer have those attachments. Does the monk, when he leaves his family to go and live in the monastery for the rest of his life, does it mean he hates his family? No. But he's detached. He still loves them, but in a detached way, not in an obsessive, I got to have you, own you forever way. And let me tell you, there's a lot of parents out there that have that I got to have you, own you personality. Even once their kids grow up, they never want to let go. And that creates unhealthy spiritual relationships that can transcend the dying process and lead to the types of attachments that, someone like me ends up having to break. So that's part of how we die well, and that explains why some people who, even though they might have gotten the tattoo or they did the roadside memorial thing or they did something else that was not advisable, it explains why they didn't have any problems. And it's because you still have to go through the consideration that the family member who died had grace. At least some form of it. Somebody mentioned having ashes scattered at sea. And having ashes scattered at sea is also perhaps a very good way to release your attachments to that individual. It creates a tremendous amount of closure, as long as you don't keep any of it. Some people will say, well, I'll scatter some of it. Or they do the separation thing. Every sibling gets it. No. I don't do that. But if all of the ashes that are held, and we're talking a very short time frame here. We're talking about the person dying. We're talking about ideally them being left alone for a minimum of 3 days. And then we're talking about very quickly after that being cremated, and then the ashes being given to the family, and then the family making immediate plans to scatter them. That's an acceptable, albeit not the most Christian type of after-death care, but it is still an acceptable way of eliminating attachment. As I said at the beginning of this program, the Christian religion and the Catholic Church don't hold the monopoly on dying well. There are other religions that do it very well as well, also. And, Hinduism and Buddhism are remarkably good examples of this. Okay.
And you know what? There's even a movement for people who might be curious. There's a movement, the Order of the Good Death. It's people who want to encourage people to talk about death while we're still alive and being able to prepare ourselves for the eventuality that we're all going to die.
Yeah.
I mean, something might save our lives once or twice, but we're going to die. We all die. We all do.
Right.
And so there are people who host death salons, and they happen all over the world. And it's a place where people gather and talk about death and what death means to them personally, what are different people's ideas on it. And they're basically trying to get this idea out there that it's not taboo to talk about it, because this is something that we've somehow managed to forget.
Yeah.
So I follow all of them on Twitter. They're awesome.
Yeah, no, that is awesome. And I mean, I think that's, ideally the way that it should unfold. No question about that. What I also would like to maybe perhaps mention here, is if you are a Christian, but the burial thing, maybe because of cost or some other reason, is not feasible to you, it is acceptable to use cremation. I mean, the church used to condemn it. Now they don't prefer it, but they're okay with it enough that you can do it without it causing too much of an issue. And then what can be done is the ashes can be buried in the rite of Christian burial performed. That's one way to do it. Another way that I do it in the Nicolaitan tradition, which the Roman Catholic Church I don't think does, but what we do would be to, if a person wants to be scattered in a particular location, like at sea, for example, it would be possible to have a priest preside at a ritual ceremony to scatter those ashes at sea. Now, the church always prefers that it's done on holy ground for the reasons that Joy mentioned. But, personally, it's really about not forming attachments. And so, scattering in some ways is even better because there's nothing left. It all just gets absorbed into nature, and that's really the best possible way that it can be done. Short of sky burial. Go check that out. Sky burial is the best. Do you know what sky burial is, Joy? Are you familiar with it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. We won't give anything away to our listeners if they don't know. They have to go watch Kundun. Did you see the movie Kundun?
No, I haven't. I'm going to
you
go
have to
check
watch
it out.
You'd have to watch that movie. It is a fabulous film. Fabulous. Very well done. And in every possible way. And they definitely show what a sky burial is. Somebody talked about prayers for the dead. And we were talking, about leaving prayers at grave sites, but also the importance of praying for the dead. So what do we do in that respect, and why is that important? Well, of course, the prayers for the dead do help to guide the recently deceased to their crossing over or afterlife condition, or what is intended to be. Because honestly, and this is going to be a hard one for a lot of conventional Christians, it is actually preferable for if a spirit is condemned to hell, which is a possibility, it would be still preferable for them to cross over into hell than to remain a wrathful spirit on earth. It is still preferable. And that's because we don't really understand hell anymore. Unfortunately, Dante didn't do us any justice with his Inferno. And now we tend to think of hell as this place of eternal torment and punishment. And really, the eternal torment and punishment is the simple fact that you had your chance to enter into eternity with God and you chose not to take it. That's the eternal punishment. That's the ultimate torture. But hell is an annihilation. It's complete absorption into the cosmos, and you're completely ripped apart into nothingness. And so that is preferable. Absolutely, in every possible way, preferable to existing as some wrathful spiritual zombie. Okay. So the prayers for the dead help to guide them, okay, for the recently deceased. And for those who have been dead for a long time, the grace you cultivate in life, they can no longer cultivate in death. This is what makes life so sacred. This is what makes life so important, is that we can go to church, receive the sacraments, and receive that grace. And it's a never-ending source of grace. We can continuously receive it. We can go to Mass every day and receive the Eucharist. We can receive reconciliation frequently. More and more grace. And then we can take that grace, and through our prayers, we can share that grace with the deceased. Those in purgatory, to help aid them in being purified so that they may enter into the kingdom of heaven. Remember, purgatory is not, as some people think, a second chance. It's not a place where one goes to be tried and they have one last chance to get it right. Purgatory is salvation. It's simply just a purification process so that they may be made perfect enough to enter into the kingdom of heaven, because nothing perfect can exist in heaven. Okay, so our prayers, the grace that we cultivate now, can be shared with the dead through those prayers. So that's one of the other things that's important about the prayers. Now, somebody also asked if gravestones, are they not a type of memorial? In a way they are, but again, remember, it's ritually sealed. Okay? And it's very different. A place of rest on holy ground is very different than a roadside cross that commemorates the very location where they lost their lives. We typically do not bury people where they died, unless it's like wartime.
Exactly. And we don't want to remember that place either, because that's a place of horror and trauma. And that's part of why people travel those miles, but the 27 miles between Blackwell's Corner to James Dean Memorial Junction. They want to see the last thing he saw. They want to experience the same drive that he experienced.
Yeah.
And I mean, they used to leave things on the side of the road. That's why they had to build the memorial, because people were just getting out of their car and that was causing another traffic hazard. And they would go there and leave offerings. And that's one of the things at the memorial, is people would leave offerings there. Even I left one, and I have the video of leaving that there, and I put that up too. So, but it was just this thing that people would go there and leave the, objects that contain their own personal energy, contributing to not only the degradation of whatever spirit might be there, but also, it turns into something else. It morphs into something else as we put more and more on it. And it's just rolling around, gathering up all this spirit energy like some kind of weird video game.
Well, yeah. And that's exactly what it is, really. I mean, people have been mystified ever since it's been discovered, the whole phenomenon of EVP. And for the paranormal investigators out there, EVP is kind of a fascinating thing. But what is it? And anyone who has collected EVPs will tell you, as I'm sure you know, Joy, yourself, EVP usually falls into two categories. One, intelligent response, and two, replay. Sort of like, just data getting played out like a record. Okay. And but in a lot of cases, the material's not even really relevant, or what you hear can be interpreted numerous ways. It's very very ambiguous.
Yeah.
And you're like, you might hear one thing and then someone else hears something else, and sometimes you hear what you see. Like, when Ghost Adventures, they'll do like a little subtitle, what they think it says.
Yeah.
And once you see the subtitle, you're kind of stuck hearing that and only that, I remember one time, in fact, I noticed it. They recently aired.
Yes, they put it up there.
They did Exorcism in Erie.
Yeah.
They did the little pop-ups, and recently, and I watched it to see what they would say in those little pop-ups, and they actually posted one of my tweets from the night that aired the first time, where in the episode you're hearing, or they thought that the voice that came through on the spirit box was "I am breeding," but I heard "I am bleeding."
Yeah,
and
it's funny because I heard that and I was like, I was looking down at the time and I looked up and said, "No, that's I'm bleeding," and I see the pop up and I'm like, "Oh well, he's got it covered."
Yeah, yeah. And I actually talked to Zach about that after the fact, and he agreed. In hindsight, it definitely sounded more like bleeding, and bleeding was more appropriate to what was going on there, because it was not breeding; it was definitely dying, and we certainly injured it at the initial blessing of Chris. So, bleeding seems to work, but that's an example of how ambiguous it can be. And so, what is EVP? What are we really collecting? And again, you're more often than not collecting the spiritual data of the cosmos. It's alive. It thinks. The universe is alive. Okay, all of it is. It's intelligent. If it weren't intelligent, you could not enjoy the intelligence that you have, because the universe could not produce something that would be anything unlike itself. So the very fact that it can produce intelligence means that it is intelligent. It has to be. It wouldn't be able to produce something that it's not capable of itself any more than you could produce. You're not going to have sexual relations with your partner, and she's not going to give birth to a cat, because that's not the human nature. Our nature is we can only produce what's of ourself, and that would be human DNA gets passed on and produces another human being. Okay, so the universe is also intelligent. So what you're really collecting in EVP, that people tend to think is spirits talking to them, but it is technically. It's just the problem is people don't know what spirits are. They think of them as more like independent ghosts of the dead and all. It's all of the data of the cosmos, all just being thrown out there in the ether. And so these devices that pick up essentially white sound and brown sound and pink sound and all these different types of static is able to tap into all of that information. And, we've known this for a long time. The whole concept of the Akashic records comes from this very understanding in the esoteric worldview. And even in psychology, Carl Jung and his collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is the Akashic records. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's kind of like, like if you ring a gong and you hear it, it keeps vibrating long after you've actually hit it. And it just keeps making that sound until it comes to a complete rest. Mm-hmm. When we go to a place that's haunted, that's a place where trauma took place. And that's going to still be resonating. It's still going to be vibrating. It's still going to be producing a little bit of that sound. And we're just picking up a little bit of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so are they the voices of the dead? Well, yes and no. It's actually both. It is not, yes, it is the voices of the dead, but it is not really the same people. It's just echoes of their essence. So, yes, you could. I don't know if you guys, how some of you, I think Sister Maximilian probably already knows where I'm going with this, but, sometimes fiction has a way of tapping into the esoteric reality through archetypes without even intending to do so, and it produces something marvelous and accurate. And Doctor Who, back in the wonderful David Tennant era, which was, I think, the best era for the new series of Doctor Who. The classic series would be definitely Tom Baker, but the new series, definitely David Tennant. And in his era of Doctor Who, there's if you got Amazon Prime, you can watch this episode. Even if you don't know anything about Doctor Who, watch this anyway, because you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when you see it. It's called Silence in the Library, and it is a wonderful example of what I'm talking about. They have these voice systems that would allow them to communicate, in their spacesuits. They're walking through, this planet, and they got this helmet, and they can communicate on this device. But when they would die, because of the way the device works, it could receive a shadow of that person's intelligence for a period of time. And then they could continue to have a conversation with the person who's been deceased, only the person didn't really know they're dead. And then they slowly break down and break down.
Turn out the lights.
Yes. Hey, turn off the light. Yeah, exactly. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That's exactly what an EVP is.
Yep.
Yeah. I really think that's, I mean, maybe maybe the person who wrote that episode did intend to say, hey, maybe this is what it is, or has some insight into it. But that's what it really is. So yes, can you get information from an EVP that's useful? Yes, you can. So that's why we still do it. Even in my work right now, when we're doing an investigation, I still rely on EVP to give me insight, because guess what? The universe is intelligent. And the room that you're in is intelligent. And that room saw everything that went on there. And that room remembers. And that room can speak to you.
Yep.
And that's the spirit realm. So when a person dies, they become one with that. So this is what I mean by yes and no. Yes, it is the voices of the dead, but no, it's not specifically who you think you're talking to. You're talking to all of it at once, because it's all been absorbed into the same source of energy. And it's remarkable when you think about it. But that's what makes the kingdom of heaven, at least in the Christian worldview, so remarkable also, because it's distinctive from that. That's our natural condition now. Okay, so we were originally created, if we're going to get a little theological here, when we were originally created prior to the fall of Adam and Eve as perfect immortal beings. Okay? And our nature was designed to be permanent. But when the original sin occurred, the consequence of that, not the punishment, but the consequence of that was death, that we would become impermanent, that we brought entropy into the universe, made the entire universe entropic. So now everything's wasting away. And so now our nature is to dissolve, is to go from a complete pattern and to slowly degrade until there's nothing left. We call that dying and death, or actually we call it aging, dying, and death. Okay, and then it dissipates. But where does it go? People ask me, like, where does the spirit go? They come in and then they leave. They come in. Well, where they go? There's nowhere to go. It's just the energy of the universe, which is all right here, right now. You have the entirety of the universe right here in your very room. You can access every point in the cosmos right now, right here. It's all accessible. You just have to know how to access it. EVP gives us one very tiny little peephole into that reality. And so, yes, we can call out and speak to somebody and then get access. And yes, if you do it in a location where they died or a location where they spent a lot of time, you're going to collect. You're going to resonate more closely to the particular vibration you're trying to reach out to.
It's sort of like how I do psychometry. Like when I touch an object and gain information, I'm not going to be able to gain information that didn't happen around the object or near the object. You know, if it's a necklace, but, you know, the person never wore it, it's not going to really give me any insight into that person. It has to have their connection, their energy, that attachment. And then you reach out to it that way, reaching out to the spirit part and interacting with that. That's what you're talking about there. Yeah.
No, that's exactly what it is. That is exactly how psychometry works. It's how all of the psychic arts work.
Yeah.
You know, people that are empathic, people that can collect psychic material or data or clairvoyance, clairaudience, all is because we are connecting to that fundamental reality in which all of the cosmos is accessible. You know, we tend to think in terms of time and space. So, you know, things out there seem very far away to us. You know, and then if it's not far away, then it's also measured in how long it would take to get to some of these distant locations. So it seems almost impossible to fathom the size of the cosmos when you think of it, even in terms of not just this universe, but in terms of a multiverse, because it actually is a multiverse. You know, but we don't really have time to get into that. If you're interested in that, you need to take my webinar on Forbidden Truth. That we have time to talk about those things there. But you know, the universe, the multiverse makes up what we would call the cosmos. It's all accessible. It's all here and now. All that distance and time are just conventions of how we process information. So in order to, like, for example, let's say I want to get into my car and drive to Miami. Okay, I'm here in Atlanta. I'm going to drive to Miami. So I'm already thinking, how many hours is that going to be? Well, it's probably going to be somewhere like 10, maybe 11 hours. I'm not quite sure, depending upon traffic. Okay. So already I have a mileage in mind, distance. I have how long it takes me to travel that distance. But what is that? We see it as a story that gets told. I pack up, I go down into my car, I turn on the engine, I punch in my address into the GPS, and then I drive down there. I arrive, turn off the car, there I am, unpack. So that's the story. But what's really happening cosmically? Nothing's happening cosmically. I didn't go anywhere. All I did is I changed my frequency to resonate with what we typically understand to be Atlanta to now resonating with what we would typically understand to be Miami. I changed my frequency. I didn't go anywhere.
And the process of changing your frequency is what you experienced as your trip.
Exactly. And so what is the idea of time and space is the mental processing of understanding and comprehending the transition between the two frequencies. But imagine if you could do that instantaneously. Well, spirits can. So much to talk about on that topic, but now it's getting a little too metaphysical.
Yeah.
But somebody asked, how far back was it? Let me see. It was a good question. I wanted to come back to it. About original sin. How they wanted to know how original sin happened. That's again a huge, massive theological topic that might be a really good episode for vestiges of Christianity. Suffice it to say, I think the biggest thing that people, and I'll say this about it, I think the biggest thing people have or problem with it is, why would a good, loving, perfect, omniscient, omnipotent God permit the devil to come into our perfect reality, trick us, and then we screw it all up, and now we're to blame? That seems very unfair. It seems ludicrous, really, because I've always likened it to kind of like, you have two toddlers, and you hire a babysitter, and then the babysitter gives the toddlers a gun. One toddler shoots the other toddler dead, and then the toddler takes the gun and accidentally shoots himself. They both end up dead, and then the babysitter comes back and said, well, it wasn't my fault. And so the people that get blamed are the toddlers, but it wasn't even really their fault. It's kind of like that. But why would it have occurred? How did it occur? And that's when we have to get into very deep levels of theological understanding about this story. Because it's just a story. It's a metaphor for some kind of ineffable reality of God that is beyond our comprehension. What you need to understand about this is that God, because he loves us, permits this to occur, because it's all part of the entire process of creation. We can't achieve to the level of perfection that would be equal to him, because what he's trying to do, actually. We're like little baby gods, and he's trying to bring us up to his level of maturity. And that can't be done unless we are willing to get on our bicycles and fall and take the training wheels off and fall and get our scraped knees. Okay? So he permits this because he knows in the plan of the entire thing it's already resolved. Because that's the omniscience. That's knowing beginning and end and having it all accessible to you at the same time. We're only seeing the one picture. And so from our vantage point, we screwed up the world and now we're having to suffer for it. But what we're not paying attention to is that if it weren't for original sin, we would never have come to know Christ. If we didn't come to know Christ, we would never have the level of intimacy that we now enjoy with God because Adam and Eve were incapable of that intimacy. It matured us. And that's why it's permitted. We could go on and on about that topic, but I just want to keep it simple tonight. Joe asked, did you ever wonder if God made the distances so great for us on Earth to be able to contact any possible intelligent life? Is it because if we were able to, we would screw them up like we do ourselves? I mean, it's definitely a possibility. The distances exist, I think, are insurmountable. Yeah, I don't know what kind of technology would be needed to be able to transit, because, I mean, we still have physical law to deal with, and we can't go faster than light. We know that. So it would have to be some type of interdimensional travel, wormhole type of physics that would allow us to sort of cheat the speed limit, because the speed of light's just not fast enough. I mean, let's face it. You look up at the sky, and you're looking at things that happened thousands of years ago. Some of those stars might even be dead, and yet we don't know it yet because the light hasn't, the light is from so long ago, and the supernova hasn't reached us. So yeah, I mean, I think if creation is as complex as it seems, and there's all these different worlds, in order to assure that different worlds don't screw up or interfere with the natural development of different worlds, sort of like a sort of theological prime directive, the best way to do that is to create such vast distances that nobody, even a sophisticated civilization, wouldn't be able to develop the technology to transcend it. Create physics that make it impossible. And so far, the physics that we understand make it impossible. We just won't be able to reach it. Not in anyone's. I mean, we'd have to get on like some kind of generational ship and then send people off there, and they just keep traveling for generations until they eventually reach someplace. But that's not efficient. I'm sorry, Joy. You seemed like you wanted to say something, and I read that question.
Yeah, there was a question that I had written down from somebody on Twitter. Megan asked about about an etheric cord attached to a loved one. Will the connection hinder the deceased loved one from moving on if the person doesn't sever that cord?
Okay, so the cord,
kind of like
like the silver, yeah,
right,
okay. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a model. It's a bit metaphorical. What we're really talking about, and I think she even mentioned this, if I remember correctly, because I do remember this question. She mentioned something about karmic
bonds, yeah.
And karmic bonds are real. I mean, this is exactly what an attachment is. Okay, so when we get back to, remember, karma, the whole idea of karma comes to us from Hinduism, and, Buddhism being sort of a heretical sect of Hinduism, sort of a schismatic sect of Hinduism, carried with it a lot of this concept of karma. And so, you see this in the reincarnation-based religions. And the fact of the matter is karma is real. I mean, it is real. There is energy. Now, we don't understand karma the way that we should in the West. We tend to think of karma as like you do something bad, and so now you have to somehow, you incur some kind of karmic debt. Now you got to pay it off. And then, you do something bad to someone else. Now you create a debt with them that creates some kind of karmic entanglement. And that's not exactly true. It's not completely wrong, but it's not it's misleading. It kind of leads us in the wrong direction is the way we understand karma. Karma is basically cosmic cause and effect. Karma has nothing to do with morality. Okay, so it doesn't care. Like, let me give you an example of how karma works in reality. There's an old Buddhist saying about this family, who's very, very hungry. They're starving. The kids are starving. They're out of food. All right, really bad shape. But they have a pig. That's all they've got left. But the tenets of not killing, it's one of the tenets of Buddhism. It's not really like a commandment, but it is a practice for good karma, that you don't kill any living thing. So they refuse to slaughter the pig even though they're hungry. Okay, and so in order to get around this, what the family does is they tie the pig to a instead of being in the farm, they take the pig out to the edge of a precipice and tie the pig very close to the precipice, so that at some point in the pig's struggle, it will fall off the cliff on its own. And then the pig will fall, die, and then they can go and eat the pig. And they're karmically clean because they did not directly kill it. It was the pig's own struggle and indiscretion at the edge of the cliff that caused the actual death of the pig. And now from our Western minds, we can't wrap our heads around that, because we think of it, well, they're still responsible. They're the ones that took the pig out there knowing that it was, was going to fall. But that's not how karma works. That's how morality works. So we're looking at it from the Western biblical concept of doing the right thing, because there's a right way to do things and the wrong way. There's a way that God wants you to do things, a way that God doesn't want you to do things. And karma is free of that kind of moral judgment. It's just about cause and effect. The actual cause of the fall for the pig was its own slip. Even though the family put it there to make it more probable that it would happen, it still died because it slipped, not because the family slaughtered it. And that's how karma works. So when we're talking about karmic bonds, we're talking about what we end up creating in relationship to ourselves, that when we hurt or harm someone, we create an energetic environment that becomes emotionalized and thus creates the seed for an attachment between two people. So the way that that's resolved is the same way that you resolve any other attachment. You let it go. So don't, if you know you're dying, one of the ways that you can die well is to die in a state of forgiveness. Get rid of all of your emotional baggage before you go. Because, and this is why it's preferable to die. The Buddhists have a saying, die with your eyes open. Because it's preferable to die mindfully than to die in your sleep unexpectedly when you're not ready for it, when you can't see it coming. That gives you an opportunity to release all of your attachments if you've done the work. So there's a skill to it. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure.
I think so. Because
Okay.
the whole, I think even in the whole first half, we were talking about like the attachments that we have to the dead, as well as the attachments they had to being alive.
Mm-hmm.
And, all of those attachments, I think that really kind of ties it up a little bit.
Good,
there.
good. I hope that answers it. If not, the person who asked that question can ask another question. We'll try our best. Joe says, I think you just answered my question. Hopefully. Okay. Let me see. I think what kind of confuses me is how a spirit in cases of tragic sudden auto accident remains at the scene of the accident, seemingly stuck there, while in other cases they follow the body. The body is whisked away after the accident, and does the spirit even know they are dead or have time to make a decision for what follows? Typically, they do not know that they're dead. In fact, that's part of the whole mindfulness practice of Buddhism, to teach a person to die awake, so that you know where you are, you know what's happening, and you know what to do. They even do death practice. Some of the sects actually teach death practice, which helps to even better drive this home. But most of the time, the average person who has not cultivated anything spiritually does not know that they died. And again, there's no real brain to work with anymore, so they don't have reason to kind of work things out. They can only work with instinct and emotion at that point. And it's typically, poor tools for that process. So you really need to cultivate your faculties of awareness to be able to move and make your instincts more sophisticated for death. So yeah, most people don't know that they've died, and the reason why some get stuck at the accident while some get stuck to the body, it depends on where those attachments lie. If a person,
and it also depends on the people that are nearby too. I mean, are the people going to the memorial site to remember them there?
Yeah.
Or are they going to the grave site?
Yeah.
Where are you doing this?
Where are you doing this? And that, yes, again, the living play a very complicit role in what occurs after death for people who are deceased. We have a massive responsibility, and we're not very good at maintaining and upholding that responsibility. In fact, we're very irresponsible mourners, particularly in the West. Less so in the East.
Yeah. Tara says that she agrees, but what about a person in a slow process of death? I think they may be more aware.
Yes.
And I think so too. I definitely believe, because my mom took forever, and I really believe that she was totally ready to go, and we had already said our goodbyes, so it didn't matter when it happened. We knew it was going to happen eventually, and we both kind of let go of that. And I think she died very well. I don't think she really even cared about coming back for anything.
Well, and you've never been disturbed by her, correct?
No, I mean, I've kind of called out to her to pull her to me, but she doesn't show up on her own, except for one time she did show up on the second anniversary of her death, and I communicated with her through a device, and it was very interesting.
Yeah.
But other than that, no.
And
she even told me, because I was reaching out for her, and she even told me, look, I like where I'm at. Just leave me alone.
Yeah. Well, see, sometimes, the grace of God will permit a spirit to return from either purgatory as part of that spirit's purification process, or even one that has entered into the beatific vision of the kingdom of heaven, if it has some purpose, almost in an angelic concept, to convey a message or to protect.
Like when I had my encounter with the saint.
Yes. Yeah. Very much so. And obviously the saints do this. We were talking about incorruptibility today on Twitter, and that's an example of why you can pray to the saints and get very remarkable help through their intercession, because they are in the beatific vision. They have no attachments. So that's why the relics actually just, all they do is all the relics contain grace. That's all they are. There's no attachment there. It's just all the grace that they had overflowing in their life just permeates their bones, their flesh. And sometimes
they even have
so much
a
grace,
sweet fragrance, like flowers.
Yep, sweet fragrance and incorruptibility. But even the saints that don't, were not incorruptible, the relics themselves still possess all the grace that they cultivated in life. And this is why relics are important to the church. Some people think it's a grotesque practice, but that's essentially what they are. Oh, my goodness. It is at the end of the show, folks. So it's such a good topic, almost worth revisiting again, doing a part 2 perhaps. But great. That
would be fun.
That would, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it?
Yeah, and what if because I'm going over the audio, I could, maybe clean some of that up and maybe share that.
Yeah, that would be good. Why don't you go ahead and see if you can clean it up, and maybe we can play it on a future episode of Vestiges After Dark. We'll actually be back here, everyone, next Friday at on October 12th.
On October 12th.
Yep, and you'll be traveling, but you'll still be...
I will be traveling, but I'll be here. Yeah.
Yes. Awesome. And I want to thank all of you out there listening tonight. I really appreciate all of you. Kelly, I just want to say thank you so much for donating. You have been so wonderful and consistent in helping to keep the show on the air. And many of you, give regularly. I really appreciate it. But I see Kelly here tonight. I wanted to make sure that I said that. Thank you. Really, from the bottom of my heart, you really help our ministry continue, and you help this show stay on the air. That's fantastic. I don't know what next topic will be, but stay tuned on my Twitter.
Oh.
Do we know?
Yeah.
What
Yes.
What's next week?
Cursed objects.
Cursed objects. All right. A good segue.
Yes.
To what we talked about tonight. So yeah, see if you can get that cleaned up, Joy, for next week, and we can maybe jump in on this and sort of like
next week I'll be traveling.
Oh yeah, that's right. Well, no, but if you could get it cleaned up, like
Maybe I can send it beforehand.
You could send it before, then I'd have it. See if you can do it.
Yeah.
If you can,
All right.
we'll air it.
All
right,
right,
everyone. God bless. Good night, and I'll see you next week.